You want to know what scares me? Sarah said, her voice barely holding together. Not them, not the bikes, not the leather, not the tattoos. What scares me is that this garage, this place everyone told me to run from is the first place in 8 months that's felt like somewhere I'm allowed to exist. Tank set down his wrench. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then you exist here. That exchange didn't happen in a courthouse or a church. It happened in a grease-stained garage at 5:30 in the morning between a homeless 17-year-old girl and the most feared biker in the county. And it changed both of their lives forever. If this story already has your attention, you're exactly who it was written for. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The car had been dead for 11 days. Not just dead in the mechanical sense, though, that was true too. The alternator fried, the battery drained to nothing, the whole machine reduced to a hunk of metal sitting on the gravel shoulder of Route 9 like a tombstone someone forgot to engrave. Dead in the way that a thing becomes when it stops being useful and starts being a reminder of everything that went wrong. Sarah Martinez had been sleeping in the back seat for those 11 days. She had a sleeping bag she'd bought at a Goodwill for $4 a duffel bag, with 2 changes of clothes and a plastic bag from a gas station that held 3 granola bars, a bottle of water, and a road atlas that no longer applied to her life because she had no destination left to plan for. She was 17 years old. She had not spoken to another human being in 6 days, not since the woman at the truck stop diner had told her not unkindly that she couldn't keep sitting in the booth without ordering something. Sarah had ordered a small coffee, nursed it for 3 hours, and then walked back to the car and sat in the dark and tried to remember what her mother's voice had sounded like. She couldn't. That was the part that scared her most. Not the hunger, not the cold, not the absolute uncertainty of what came next. The part that scared her was that she was already starting to forget. Her mother had died 14 months ago. Ovarian cancer, late-stage diagnosed and fatal inside of 9 months. Sarah had been 16 when the diagnosis came, 17 when the coffin went into the ground. Her father had been out of the picture since she was 4, not dead, just gone, which somehow felt worse. There were no aunts or uncles worth mentioning. There was a grandmother in New Mexico who Sarah had met exactly twice and who had made it clear in the polite but immovable way of someone reading from a script they'd prepared in advance that she was in no position to take on a teenager. The state had gotten involved. There had been a foster placement, a family in Ridgewood, decent enough on paper, 2 kids of their own, a house that smelled like dryer sheets and frozen dinners. Sarah had lasted 4 months before the older son had started coming into her room at night, and the foster mother had looked at her over breakfast one morning but with an expression that said she already knew and had already decided not to do anything about it. Sarah had packed her bag that afternoon while the house was empty and walked out the front door and never looked back. She'd been living in the car, her mother's car, the one thing that hadn't been repossessed or assigned to someone else during the estate proceedings, for 8 months before the alternator gave out. 8 months of gas station bathrooms and library Wi-Fi and job applications that went nowhere because she had no address, no phone number that stayed active longer than a prepaid card could sustain, and no references that didn't lead back to a system that had already failed her. 8 months of being invisible. The cold that morning was the kind that settles into your bones and stays there. Sarah sat up in the back seat at 4:45 a.m., pulled the sleeping bag tighter, and looked at the road atlas open on the seat beside her. She'd circled 3 things the night before with a pen she'd found in the glove compartment. The first 2 were shelters. Both had wait lists she'd already been on. One had called her back 6 weeks ago to say a spot had opened, but by then her prepaid had run out and she'd missed the call, and the spot had gone to someone else. The third thing she'd circled wasn't a shelter. It was an address she'd copied down from a handwritten notice pinned onto a bulletin board outside the laundromat on 5th, the kind of bulletin board that gets papered with missing cat flyers and AA meeting times and offers from people trying to sell furniture. The notice had been small, printed on yellow paper, and it had said simply, cleaning work available, early hours, physical labor, garage on Kellerman Road, ask for Tank. She'd torn it down and put it in her pocket and spent 3 days talking herself out of it. Kellerman Road was on the far east side of town, past the rail yard in the stretch of industrial blocks where the streetlights were sparse and most of the businesses ran without signs. She knew the area the way you know an area when you've slept in a car within a mile of it, not from walking through it voluntarily, but from passing it in the dark and noting without wanting to what was there. The garage on Kellerman was there. She'd seen it, hard to miss. Iron Eagle Customs. She'd also heard about it. That was the problem. The woman at the truck stop, the one who'd let her sit with the coffee, had warned her without being asked, just because she'd overheard Sarah asking the cashier about work on that side of town. The woman had leaned across from the next booth, lowered her voice to the register people use when they're genuinely trying to help, and said, "Honey, don't go anywhere near Kellerman Road. That garage is Hell's Angels. Those aren't just bikers. Those are men who've been in prison, men who've done things. You're young. You don't want anything to do with that." Sarah had nodded and thanked her and meant every word of it. That had been 4 days ago. Since then, she'd eaten one granola bar and a packet of peanut butter crackers she'd found wedged under the passenger seat. She looked at the circled address on the map for a long time. Then she folded the atlas, stuffed it in her duffel bag, pulled on her second pair of socks, over the first pair, laced her boots, and got out of the car. The walk to Kellerman Road took 40 minutes in the cold. She didn't let herself think too hard about where she was going. When she started thinking, she started second-guessing. And when she started second-guessing, she would stop walking, and if she stopped walking, she would go back to the car, and the car was dead, and she had one granola bar left, and she needed this to work. So she walked. She kept her head down. She counted her steps when the fear got loud. She heard the garage before she saw it. Not music she'd expected, music some cliché of classic rock bleeding out under a roll-up door. What she heard instead was the low mechanical sound of an engine being turned over and over, not catching someone, methodically working through a problem in the dark. The sound of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and wasn't in any hurry. The front of the garage was closed. 2 motorcycles were parked outside. One of them was clearly being used, scratched and road-worn and practical. The other had been stripped to almost nothing, just a frame and a front fork leaning on a jack stand like a patient waiting for surgery. There was a side door. A light was on inside. Sarah stood outside it for a full 2 minutes. Her breath made small clouds in the cold. She thought about the woman at the truck stop. She thought about her mother. She thought about the foster house and the sound of a door handle turning in the dark. She knocked on the side door. Nothing happened for long enough that she almost left. Then the door opened. The man on the other side of it was enormous. Not in the cartoonish way of someone inflated by vanity, but in the way of someone who had spent decades doing physical work and whose body had simply become what the work required. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, with a beard trimmed close enough to look deliberate, and arms that were almost entirely covered in ink. Not the fashion kind, but the kind that accumulates over 20 or 30 years. Different artists and different eras layered over each other like geological strata. He was wearing a black leather vest over a gray Henley, and the vest had patches on it that Sarah recognized in the abstract way you recognize something you've been warned about. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "You lost." Sarah had rehearsed 6 different versions of this moment on the walk over. Every single one of them dissolved. What came out was, "I saw the notice about cleaning work. I'm looking for Tank." The man's expression didn't change. He studied her for a moment the way a mechanic studies a part he doesn't immediately recognize, not with suspicion exactly, but with a specific kind of attention. "That notice has been up there for 3 weeks, and he said, "You're the first person who came." "I know," Sarah said. "I almost didn't." He was quiet for another beat. Then he stepped back from the door and held it open. "I'm Tank," he said. "Come in. It's cold." The inside of the garage was warmer than she expected. Not warm exactly, there was no central heating, just a space heater in the corner doing its best against a space built for machines, and not for comfort, but warm enough that the first thing she did when the door closed behind her was feel her shoulders drop half an inch from where they'd been locked around her ears for the entire walk over. There were 3 other men in the garage. She registered them the way you register things when you're in a new space and still deciding whether it's safe, not cataloging details exactly, but noting presence, noting where everyone was standing, noting who was looking at her and who wasn't. The one closest to her was working on an engine block laid out on a steel table. He was lean, maybe 40, with pale eyes, in the kind of stillness that isn't calm exactly, but is what calm looks like when it's been earned the hard way. He glanced at her once and went back to what he was doing. The one in the back was big in a different way than Tank, broader, softer looking, with a gray beard and forearms like dock rope. He'd been drinking coffee when she walked in, and he'd set the mug down when the door opened, and now he was watching her the way older men sometimes watch young women who show up unexpectedly, trying to figure out what the story is before committing to a reaction. The third one was young, younger than the others, maybe late 20s with a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, and the expression of someone who had learned early that his face made people nervous and had stopped trying to do anything about it. He wasn't looking at her at all. He was writing something in a notebook. Tank didn't introduce anyone. He walked to a small table near the space heater, poured coffee from a thermos into a second mug, and held it out to her. She took it. The mug was heavy ceramic with the Iron Eagle logo on the side. The coffee was hot and black and tasted like salvation. "How old are you?" Tank said. It wasn't really a question. Sarah had planned to lie. 18 had felt plausible enough. But something about the way he'd asked it direct without judgment, the way you ask something because you need the actual answer, and not the answer someone thinks you want to hear, made the lie evaporate to Washington. "Ahoy that you me, deja," she said. Nobody in the garage reacted. Tank nodded slightly. "You in school?" "I was." "Parents?" "My mother died 14 months ago," Sarah said. "There's nobody else." Something moved across Tank's face, not pity. She would have recognized pity and braced against it, but something she couldn't name immediately. Acknowledgement, maybe? Recognition of a fact rather than performance of a feeling about it. "Where are you staying?" he asked. She thought about lying again. "My car," she said. "Route 9, the alternator's gone." Tank looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the lean man by the engine block. "Ghost," he said. The lean man looked up. "Make a note to look at a car on Route 9. Alternator." Ghost looked at Sarah, then at Tank, then went back to his engine. "Noted," he said in the flat voice of someone who files things away and deals with them. Sarah felt something crack open in her chest. She pressed her lips together and stared at the coffee mug and worked very hard at keeping her face even. "The cleaning job," she said. "What does it pay?" "12 an hour to start," Tank said. 5 a.m. to 9, Monday through Friday, floors, benches, equipment. Some days there's more. Some days there's less. You show up on time, you do the work, you don't touch anything on the bikes without asking, and we get along fine. "Okay," Sarah said. "Okay," Tank said. He poured himself coffee. "You eaten today?" "No, none." He crossed to a mini fridge against the wall, pulled out a paper bag, and set it on the table in front of her. "Danny brought breakfast burritos. There's 2 left." The man with the notebook, Danny, apparently didn't look up. "She can have both," he said. "I ate 3 on the way over." Sarah looked at the bag. She looked at Tank. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't thank me, just show up tomorrow." She showed up that morning. She showed up the next morning. She showed up every morning after that. The work itself was not complicated. It was physically demanding. The garage was large, the equipment was heavy, and the kind of grime that accumulates in a working motorcycle shop is the particular combination of oil, grease, metal dust, and exhaust residue that has no interest in leaving without a fight. But Sarah had been doing hard physical work her whole life because her mother had never had enough money to avoid it, and so neither had she. She knew how to scrub. She knew how to lift. She knew how to push through the last hour when her back was screaming and her hands were starting to blister. What she didn't know was the silence. Not silence exactly, the garage was never actually quiet during working hours. Not with engines running and tools banging, and the occasional low conversation between men who'd known each other long enough to communicate in shorthand. But there was a particular quality to the quiet between those sounds. Nobody demanded anything from her that she hadn't agreed to. Nobody asked her questions she didn't want to answer. Nobody looked at her in any of the ways she'd learned to dread. On her third morning, Ghost stopped what he was doing while she was sweeping near his workstation and said without turning around, "You're doing it wrong." Sarah stopped. "Doing what wrong?" "Sweeping toward yourself. You are moving the debris toward your own feet. You want to push it outward and then turn." She looked at the broom. She looked at the floor. "Oh," she said. "Don't feel bad," Ghost said, still not turning around. "Nobody teaches people how to sweep properly. It's one of those things." "Were you the one who taught himself?" she asked. He was quiet for a beat. Then the corner of his mouth moved barely, but she caught it. The Army, he said. They're very serious about floor sweeping. Were you in the Army long? Another beat, longer. Long enough, he said, and went back to the engine. She learned to sweep outward. She also learned over the next week that Ghost was the kind of person whose silences weren't hostility, they were just where he lived. He would go an entire morning without speaking and then produce a single sentence of devastating precision and then go silent again, and the sentence would turn out to have been worth waiting for. Big Jim, the broad gray-bearded man in the back, was the opposite. Big Jim talked. He talked while he worked. He talked during breaks. He talked to whoever would listen and to the engines when no one would. His voice was a low, rolling bass that seemed to vibrate in the floor joists, and he told stories the way men tell stories when they've spent a long time somewhere. Stories were the only currency available. He'd done 7 years in Folsom. He didn't try to hide it, and he didn't lead with it. It came out on her 4th morning when he mentioned entirely without drama that he hadn't eaten a meal. He'd cooked himself until he was 38 years old, and when she'd asked why, he'd said simply couldn't in Folsom. She'd nodded. He'd gone on with his story. Danny, the youngest of them, had a quality she recognized from her own mirror. The quality of someone who had been defined by other people's fear of them for so long that they'd stopped explaining themselves to strangers. The scar on his jaw was from a car accident at 16, not a fight, though he'd long since stopped clarifying that when people asked. He'd grown up in a group home outside Sacramento. He'd been working at Iron Eagle for 3 years. He brought breakfast burritos on Tuesday mornings and picked up the parts orders on Friday afternoons, and he kept a notebook in his chest pocket that he wrote in intermittently throughout the day in handwriting she could never quite read from a distance. On her 5th morning, she asked him what he wrote in it. He looked at her. He looked at the notebook. He looked back at her. "Things I don't want to forget," he said. "Like what?" He thought about it. Today, someone brought a 73 shovel head in and said it was running rough. Ghost listened to it for 20 seconds and said it was the timing chain. He was right. I wanted to remember how he knew. How did he know? Danny flipped the notebook open, skimmed a few lines, and read aloud in a voice that suggested he was reading Ghost's exact words from memory. "The roughness at idle with a shovel head, that old means the chain has enough play to lose timing on the compression stroke. You can hear it if you listen to where in the cycle the roughness peaks." He closed the notebook. That's worth remembering. Sarah thought about that for the rest of the morning. On her 6th morning, Tank found her in the break area not eating. She had a thermos of coffee she'd made at the gas station, her own thermos now $2 at the dollar store, and she was sitting with both hands wrapped around it and looking at nothing. He sat down across from her without asking. "How's the car situation?" he asked. "Ghost looked at it Tuesday," she said. "He said the alternator is shot and the battery is too far gone to jump. He gave me a list of parts. And I don't have the money yet." She'd been paid twice. The second check had gone to a storage unit, $10 a month, the cheapest she could find, so she could move her mother's boxes out of the car and have somewhere to sleep flat. "I'm saving." Tank was quiet for a moment. "Ghost ordered the parts," he said. "He's putting them on the shop account." Sarah looked up. "I didn't ask him to do that." "No," Tank said. "He did it anyway. That's how Ghost is. You can pay the shop back when you're able. No timeline." She felt that thing in her chest again, the crack, the opening, the sensation of something under pressure, suddenly having somewhere to go. She pressed her fist against her sternum and took a breath. "Why?" she said, not ungratefully, genuinely needing to understand. Tank turned his coffee mug in a slow circle on the table. He seemed to be choosing his words with the same care he applied to the mechanical work she'd watched him do deliberately, knowing that the right choice mattered and the wrong one would cost you. "I grew up in South Phoenix," he said. "My father was not a good man, and my mother wasn't there. I was 16 when I had nowhere to sleep, and I walked into a garage not that different from this one, and a man I didn't know gave me a job sweeping floors." He looked at her. "That man's name was Walter Briggs. He's been dead 12 years. I've thought about him almost every day since." Sarah said nothing. "Inside this garage," Tank said, "we protect each other. That's not a motto. That's just how it works. You're here, you're working, you do your job, you're one of us. It's not complicated." "The whole town thinks you're dangerous," Sarah said. She didn't soften it. She'd learned in the last 6 days that he responded better to directness then to careful phrasing. He smiled. It was a real smile, not the guarded kind that reached his eyes and changed his whole face. The whole town thought Walter Briggs was dangerous too, he said. He was one of the gentlest men I've ever known. People see the leather and the bikes and the patches, and they make up a story because it's easier than paying attention. What's the real story? He looked at her for a long time. Come back for 6 more months and I'll tell you. Child. By the end of the second week, she had a routine that felt for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember like something that belonged to her. She woke at 4:15 in the storage unit. Tank had quietly cleared out a back corner and put a cot there without announcement, just mentioned one morning that there was a cot in the back if she needed it, and never raised the subject again. She made coffee on the hot plate she'd bought with her first week's pay. She walked to the garage in the dark. She was always there before Tank, and Tank was always there before everyone else. She'd started noticing things about the shop itself, the organization of it, the way every tool had a place, and the place was logical, the way parts were cataloged with a specificity that Ghost managed with the focused intensity of someone who'd found the thing they were built for, the way certain bikes in the back corner were given a different kind of attention than the customer bikes, handled with something almost like tenderness, worked on in the slow hours of early morning. On a Thursday toward the end of her second week, she asked Ghost what the bikes in the back were. He put down his wrench. He actually turned around and looked at her, which felt significant. Club bikes, he said, our bikes. They look different than the customer bikes. They are different. He picked the wrench back up. The customer bikes come in broken and go out fixed. The club bikes come in as something and go out as something else. Danny calls it building a story. Danny's the one with the notebook, Sarah said. Danny, Ghost said with a precision that held something warm beneath it, is the one who taught himself to read at 22 years old because he wanted to understand engine manuals, and no one had bothered teaching him when he was young enough for it to be easy. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I watch you work on one sometime? Not touch, just watch." Ghost considered this for a long time. Then he said, "Come in Saturday. The shop's closed. It's quieter." She came in Saturday. That was the day Ghost started teaching her what the sounds meant. The end of the third week brought the first sign of trouble. She'd been at the gas station down the road from the shop, the one where she bought her coffee supplies and charged her phone, when a police cruiser pulled up to the pump beside her. The officer who got out was younger than she expected, maybe 30, with the kind of face that runs through expressions quickly without committing to any of them. He looked at her. She looked at him. She did the calculation she'd been doing since the first week she was 17. She was in proximity to a motorcycle club that the local police department did not appear to love, and she was a minor without a legal guardian, which meant her presence at Iron Eagle was exactly the kind of thing that could be framed in ways that had nothing to do with the actual facts. "You work over at the garage," the officer said. Not aggressive, almost casual. "I do cleaning work," she said, 5 to 9. "How long?" 3 weeks. He nodded slowly in the way of someone filing information. "You know what that place is?" "A motorcycle repair shop," Sarah said. She kept her voice flat and her face neutral. "It's an outlaw motorcycle club," he said. "Those men have records, most of them." "I'm aware they have records," she said. "I'm also aware I'm 17. I have no family, I had no income, and they gave me a job. I don't know what you want me to say." The officer looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not sympathy exactly, but the moment when a situation refuses to fit the frame someone brought to it. "What's your name?" he said. "Sarah Martinez." "You in the system?" "Foster system, yes. Active placement on paper. The placement's gone." He took that in. He looked at the garage down the road. He looked back at her. "Be careful," he said. It came out differently than she expected. Not a warning wrapped in authority, but something closer to honest. "I am careful," she said. "I'm the most careful I've ever been." She paid for her coffee supplies and walked back to the garage. She told Tank about it that afternoon. That he listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "Rodriguez have a first name?" He didn't give one. "Young guy, right eye, a little lazy." She thought about it. "Maybe." "That's Jimmy Rodriguez. His brother Marco used to ride with the crew we had trouble with 6 years back. He's had eyes on this shop since he made patrol." Tank set down what he was working on. "He say anything threatening?" "No, he told me to be careful." "That's something?" He looked at her directly. You don't need to be scared of him, but you need to know he's going to ask around about you. Social services may get involved. The word social services hit Sarah somewhere behind the sternum. She kept her face even. If they get involved, she said carefully, what happens to the won't? Tank looked at her steadily. Nothing happens to the barnet, he said, but there may be a fight. Are you okay with a fight? She thought about 8 months in a car. She thought about the foster house and the door handle in the dark and the breakfast table in the foster mother's face. She thought about Ghost ordering alternator parts without being asked, and Danny and his notebook, and Big Jim's laugh that was too big for any room but somehow fit perfectly anyway. Yes, she said. I'm okay with a fight. Tank nodded. He picked up what he'd been working on. Good, he said, because I think one's coming. The fight Tank had predicted didn't announce itself. It arrived the way real trouble always does, sideways through a door you weren't watching. It started with a phone call. Sarah was in the back of the garage on a Monday morning, working through the second hour of her shift, when Tank's cell rang. He answered it, said 3 words, and went completely still. She'd been around him long enough by then, just over 3 weeks, to know that stillness on Tank meant something had gone wrong. When he moved normally, he was always in motion, hands, adjusting, shifting weight, picking things up and putting them down. When he went still, he'd shifted into a different mode entirely. He hung up and looked at Ghost. Carla from the county welfare office, he said. Someone filed a report, anonymous, minor living on premises. Ghost set his wrench down without a sound. Big Jim, who'd been in the back sorting a parts delivery, appeared in the doorway. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with his arms crossed and waited. Sarah kept her hands moving on what she was cleaning. She didn't look up. That's me, she said. That's you, Tank said. Rodriguez. Don't know yet. Could be him. Could be somebody else. He crossed his arms, mirroring Big Jim without realizing it. Carla wants to come by this week. She wants to see the space, talk to you, document the arrangement. What does that mean for me? It means, Tank said carefully, that we need to think about this correctly, because you're 17 and in the state's eyes, you're still a ward until you're 18, and that means the state has opinions about where you sleep. Sarah looked up then. My birthday is in 4 months. 4 months is a long time in a custody situation. She put down the cleaning cloth. She turned to face him fully. What do they want to do? Put me back in a placement? That's the option they'll start with. No, she said. The word came out quieter than she intended, but harder. That's not happening. Tank studied her face. He'd gotten good, she'd noticed, at reading what was under her expressions rather than just the expression itself. Tell me why, he said, not because he doubted her, but because he wanted her to say it out loud. She told him about the foster house. Not everything, not the part about the door handle in the dark, not yet. That part still lived too deep to extract, without cost, but enough. She told him about the foster mother's breakfast table face, about walking out with her duffel bag and knowing she was walking into nothing and choosing the nothing anyway because the nothing was safer. When she finished, Big Jim had moved fully into the room. Danny had closed his notebook. Ghost had turned around. Tank said, okay, just that. Then we're going to need to do this the right way. What does that mean? It means when Carla gets here, she sees a legitimate work situation, which it is. It means the space you're sleeping in has a proper address filed for it, which it doesn't yet. And it means you need an adult who can act as a responsible party for a minor in a work environment. He paused. I called my lawyer this morning while you were in the back. Her name is Patricia Oakes. She's going to meet with you this week. Sarah blinked. You called your lawyer? I have a lawyer, Tank said with a mildness that was somehow funny and somehow devastating at the same time. People seem surprised by that. I'm not surprised, Danny said from the corner. I've met Patricia. Patricia? Big Jim said, nodding slowly with the tone of someone confirming that a large weapon is available. Ghost, who almost never laughed, made a sound that was probably the closest he got to one. Sarah looked around at all of them. The crack in her chest from the previous weeks, the one that had been opening slowly, admission by admission, coffee mug by coffee mug, split a little further. She said, I don't know how to pay any of you back for this. Tank said, you show up at 5 a.m. and do your job. That's payment. That's not... Sarah. His voice was flat and final and completely without cruelty. That's payment. We're done discussing it. She showed up at 5 a.m. the next morning, same as always. Patricia Oakes arrived at the garage on Wednesday at 8 o'clock in the morning, and Sarah understood immediately why Big Jim had nodded the way he did. Patricia was 62, compact gray-haired, wearing a blazer with a small American flag pin on the lapel, and carrying a legal pad that already had 3 pages of notes on it before she'd said good morning to anyone. She'd been Tank's attorney for 11 years, she explained to Sarah, handling primarily business law and occasional civil matters. She'd also dealt with the county welfare system enough times to know exactly how it moved and where its leverage points were. She sat with Sarah at the break table for 45 minutes. She asked questions the same way a good mechanic listens to an engine methodically without impatience, attentive to what the answer implied as much as what it said. At the end, she turned to a fresh page on the legal pad and said, "Here's what we're dealing with. You have 4 months until your 18th birthday. The county has an obligation to provide a safe placement until that birthday. If they determine the current situation is unsafe, they can move you. Our job is to make sure they can't determine that." "Is the situation unsafe?" Sarah said. Patricia looked at her evenly. "No. Is it unconventional? Yes. Are there 5 men with criminal records working in this space?" She tapped her pen twice on the pad. "Also yes. So we document everything. Work agreement, pay stubs, formal address for the sleeping arrangement, structured schedule emergency contacts. We make the unconventional look like the most documented situation in the county. Can they still move me if they want to?" "They can try," Patricia said, "but trying is different from succeeding." She closed the legal pad. "You're not a child who needs rescuing, Sarah. You're a young woman who found a functioning support structure after a genuinely terrible 18 months. My job is to make sure the county understands the difference." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why are you doing this?" Patricia's expression shifted the smallest softening fast enough that you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. "Because Tank asked me to," she said, "and because Tank asking me to means it matters. In 11 years, he's asked me for 3 things. I take the ask seriously." She stood up, smoothed her blazer. "I'll have the paperwork ready by Friday. You'll need to sign 3 documents. Bring ID." "I have ID," Sarah said. Patricia nodded briskly and walked out through the garage where Ghost Big Jim and Danny were all doing an extremely unconvincing impression of people who hadn't been listening. "Patricia, Big Jim," said as she passed. "Jim," she said without slowing down. The door closed behind her. "She terrifies me," Danny said. "Good," Ghost said. "She's supposed to." Carla from the county welfare office came on Friday. She was younger than her voice had suggested, mid-30s, professional, with the particular brand of exhaustion that social workers carry when they're still idealistic enough to care but have been doing the job long enough to know how often caring doesn't change outcomes. She walked through the garage without touching anything, asked Tank 4 questions, asked Sarah 12, spent 15 minutes reviewing the documentation Patricia had prepared, and then sat in her car in the parking lot for 10 minutes before coming back inside. "I'm going to be direct with you," she said to Sarah. Not to Tank, to Sarah, which Sarah noted and respected. "My job is to protect your welfare. That means I need to understand this situation well enough to know whether it does that." "Okay," Sarah said. "What I'm seeing is a work arrangement that's properly documented, a sleeping space that's registered as a secondary address, a legal representative, and 3 weeks of pay stubs." She paused. "What I'm also seeing is 5 adult men with criminal histories, a motorcycle club premises, and a 17-year-old girl with no family." "Yes," Sarah said, "that's accurate. Tell me why I should feel comfortable leaving you here." Sarah had thought about this. Not the answer she was supposed to give, the answer that checked Carla's boxes, but the actual answer, the true one. "Because 8 months ago I was sleeping in a car," she said. "Before that I was in a foster placement where the older son came into my room at night and the foster mother looked at me across the breakfast table and chose not to do anything about it." She watched Carla's face, watched the professional mask absorb that information. "I didn't report it because I was scared and because I'd already learned that the system's response to things like that is usually to move me somewhere else and file a paper that doesn't change what already happened." Carla didn't speak. "The men in this garage," Sarah continued, "have not done one single thing that made me feel unsafe. Ghost ordered car parts for me without being asked. Big Jim brings extra burritos, so there's always enough. Danny, she stopped for half a second. Danny is teaching me to read engine manuals because he taught himself at 22, and he says it's easier with someone helping. She looked at Carla directly. I know what unsafe feels like. I have an accurate read on it. This is not that. The room was very quiet. Carla made a note on her clipboard. She made 2 more notes. She said, I'll need to return in 30 days for a follow-up visit. That's fine, Sarah said, and I want a contact number for your attorney. Patricia left her card. Yeah, Tank said from across the room where he had been standing quietly with his arms crossed. He walked over and handed the card across. Carla took it. She looked at Tank for a moment, the same look the young officer, Rodriguez, had given him, the recalibration, and then she nodded and walked out. The moment the door closed, Sarah sat down on the nearest bench, hard the way your body responds when adrenaline exits fast. Big Jim put a hand on her shoulder, one huge, brief, solid contact. You did good, he said. My hands are shaking, she said. Yeah, he said. That means you meant it. 2 weeks later, the alternator was fixed and the car ran. Ghost did it on a Saturday, same as the morning lessons. Sarah helped, which meant she handed him tools and asked questions. He answered with the precise minimum number of words required. By the end of it, she understood in a practical rather than theoretical sense what an alternator actually did and why the failure mode had manifested the way it had. When it started and the electrical system came back online and the dash lights glowed, she sat in the driver's seat and Ghost stood beside the open door, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Ghost said, the belt's going to need replacing in about 4 months. I'll show you how. Okay, she said. Her voice was slightly unsteady. The brake pads are also marginal. Don't leave those. Okay. He tapped the door frame twice. That was Ghost for you did well. She'd learned his language by then. She drove it back to the storage unit turned sleeping space and sat in the parking lot for a while. She called nobody because there was nobody to call. But for the first time in 8 months, she was not in a dead car. She was in a car that worked, that she was paying to maintain, that was hers in a way that felt real rather than just legal. She cried for about 6 minutes and then stopped and made coffee on the hot plate and went to bed. She was at the garage at 4:55 the next morning. The next twist came from a direction none of them were watching. His name was Marcus Webb, and Sarah first heard it from Danny, who mentioned it the way you mention a weather system. You can see on the horizon, not alarmingly, but with the steady attention of someone who knows what that particular formation usually means. Webb was in today while you were on a parts run, Danny said to Tank one Tuesday afternoon. Sarah was in earshot sweeping the back section. She kept sweeping. Said he had a customer inquiry about the Harley restoration in Bay 3. Bay 3's not taking outside inquiries, Tank said. That bike's promised to Weston. I told him that. He said he understood. He also looked around for about 10 minutes longer than an inquiry takes. Danny's voice was even measured. He clocked the storage area. The sweeping sound stopped. Tank's voice, when it came, had changed in a way Sarah now recognized, flatter, quieter, and somehow more dangerous than his loud voice ever was. What do you mean, clocked it? He asked who was staying back there, Danny said. I said it wasn't relevant to any inquiry he had. He said he was just curious. He smiled while he said it. A beat of silence. He leave a card, Tank said. He left a card. Sarah heard the sound of a business card being placed on the metal table. She came around the corner and looked at it. The card read Webb Motorsport Group, Marcus Webb, Director of Operations. Clean design, glossy stock, the kind of card that cost real money to print. Who is he? She asked. Tank picked up the card and looked at it. His face was neutral, but she'd learned to read what was behind neutral. Webb's have been trying to buy this property for 2 years, he said. He's got a development operation 3 blocks north, and he wants the Kellerman corridor for a commercial expansion. This garage sits in the middle of it. You didn't sell? No. Why not? Tank set the card back down. Because this isn't just a garage, he said. It was the same tone he'd used when he'd told her about Walter Briggs, factual, and carrying everything beneath the fact. Because if I sell, Ghost has nowhere to work. Jim has nowhere to be. Danny loses the first stable situation he's had in his life. He looked at her. And 3 weeks ago, you'd have had nowhere to clean floors at 5 in the morning. Sarah looked at the business card. What does he want with me? He doesn't want anything with you specifically, Tank said. He wants a pressure point, A minor on the premises of a motorcycle club is a pressure point. The word landed in her chest like a stone into still water. She watched the ripples. He's going to use me to go after you, she said. He's going to treat. Then we don't give him anything to use. She looked at Tank directly. What do we need to do? Tank studied her for a moment. Then he said the thing she'd been waiting to hear without knowing she was waiting for it. We need to make sure that when anyone looks at this situation, the county, the police, a lawyer, anyone Webb sends, what they see is exactly what it actually is, not what it looks like, what it is. What is it? He took a breath. This was the most she'd seen him work to find words. It's a garage, he said, run by people who got written off by the world a long time ago, who found that the best way to not drown was to grab whoever else was drowning nearby. That's what it is. It doesn't look like much from the outside, but from the inside, he stopped. From the inside, it's everything, Sarah said. He looked at her for a long second, then he nodded once. From the inside, it's everything, he confirmed, and I'm not selling it. Marcus Webb came back on a Thursday. He came back with a man Sarah didn't recognize, older 50s wearing a sport coat that didn't match the neighborhood, carrying a folder under his arm. Webb himself was medium height, handsome in the generic way of men who'd invested in looking approachable, with the easy confidence of someone who expected rooms to arrange themselves around him. He walked into the garage the way you walk into a room you already consider yours. He asked for Tank by name. Tank came out of the back, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and stood in a way that said he was in no particular hurry and under no particular pressure. Marcus, Tank said. The tone was the kind of neutral that has a locked door behind it. Tank, Webb smiled. This is Dan Everett. He handles property assessment for our development group. Everett nodded. Tank didn't introduce himself back. I want to make you an updated offer, Webb said. The property value in this quarter has gone up significantly in the last 8 months. I think you'd be surprised. I've told you 3 times, Tank said. This property's not for sale. Everything's for sale, Webb said, still smiling. It's just a question of finding the right number. Not this, Tank said. Webb's smile stayed put but changed in quality, the warmth draining out of it like heat from a closed room. I heard you've got a minor on the premises, he said. 17-year-old girl. Living here, staff, Tank said. Fully documented work arrangement. Welfare's been out, Tank said. Cleared. Webb tilted his head slightly. I also heard she's got no guardian. Foster system. The air in the garage changed. Sarah couldn't see Danny from where she was, but she heard the notebook close with a sharp sound. Big Jim appeared in the doorway to the parts room. Ghost stepped away from his workstation without looking like he was doing it. That's not relevant to any conversation you and I are having, Tank said. His voice hadn't changed volume or register. That was the part that was frightening. Webb spread his hands in a reasonable gesture. I'm just saying the optics of a minor living in an outlaw motorcycle club garage might not be ideal. From a regulatory standpoint, from a welfare standpoint. The optics, Tank said, are managed by a lawyer you won't enjoy dealing with. Is there anything else? Webb looked around the garage. He looked at Big Jim in the doorway. He looked at Ghost's back. He looked briefly at the area where Sarah was standing, and she watched him calculate her into the equation with a precision that was visible on his face if you knew how to read it. No, he said, not today. He reached into the folder Everett was holding and placed a printed document on the workbench. Updated offer in writing. Think about it. Tank didn't look at it. I'll recycle it. Webb nodded pleasantly as if this were the expected move in a known sequence. He and Everett walked out. The door had barely closed when Big Jim said low and deliberate, that man is going to be a problem. He's already a problem, Ghost said. He's been a problem. Danny had his notebook open again. Sarah didn't know what he was writing, but she suspected he was noting everything Webb had said, the exact words, the way he'd always noted the things he needed to remember. She was looking at the document on the workbench. Can I see it? She asked Tank. He nodded. She picked it up. It was a formal property offer, yes, with a number that was substantial. She didn't know real estate, but she knew it was a lot of money. But that wasn't what caught her eye. At the bottom in the legal boilerplate, there was a clause she had to read twice to understand. It referenced zoning compliance requirements for commercial properties operating in a transitional residential zone. It referenced regulatory reporting obligations for businesses employing minors. She set it down. He's not just offering to buy, she said. He's letting you know what he's going to do if you don't sell. Yes, Tank said. He's going to file regulatory complaints. About the zoning, about me. Probably. She looked at him. She thought about Carla's clipboard and Patricia's legal pad and Rodriguez watching from the gas station lot. She thought about all of it, converging at once about the way Webb had calculated her into the room as a pressure point. I won't let him use me to take this from you, she said. The anger in her voice surprised her, not hot anger, something colder and more certain. I won't let that happen. Tank looked at her for a long moment. He crossed the garage and picked up the document and folded it once and put it in his vest pocket. I know, he said. That's not what worries me. What worries you? He was quiet for a beat, long enough that everyone in the garage heard the answer coming before he said it. What worries me, he said, is that Webb doesn't lose clean. He's going to come at this from 3 directions at once, and one of those directions is going to surprise us. 3 days later, it did. Rodriguez showed up at 6:45 in the morning with his patrol car parked outside and a printed form in his hand and an expression that, for the first time since she'd met him, looked genuinely uncomfortable. I need to speak with Marcus Rodriguez, he said, using Tank's legal first name, which was the first indication that this was not informal. Tank came out. He looked at the form, his jaw set. Court date, he said. Rodriguez nodded. Complaint filed through the county prosecutor's office. Zoning violation, commercial operation in restricted zone, and he glanced at Sarah. He looked briefly like he'd rather be somewhere else. Endangerment of a minor, based on a complaint from a third party. Nobody said anything. Sarah looked at the form, then she looked at Tank. Tank was looking at the form with the expression she now knew was what he wore when something was serious enough that he wasn't going to perform any feeling about it. He said, Patricia Oakes is going to want to see that. I'd expect so, Rodriguez said. He held out the form. Tank took it. Rodriguez turned to go, then stopped. He turned back specifically to Sarah and said quietly, not as an officer, but as a person. For what it's worth, I didn't file it. Then he got in the car and drove away. Sarah stared at the spot where the car had been. Big Jim stood behind her. Danny was very still. Ghost hadn't moved from his position by the workbench, but his eyes were on Tank. Tank looked at the form one more time, then folded it deliberately and put it in the same vest pocket as Webb's offer. I'm calling Patricia, he said. Tank, Sarah said. He looked at her. Whatever this costs, she said, I need you to know I'm not going anywhere. Whatever they try to do, I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her for a long time. His expression did something complicated and quiet. I know, he said. Neither are we. Patricia Oakes called Tank at 7:15 that same morning before he'd even had a chance to dial her number. He answered on the second ring and she said without preamble, I already know. I have a contact at the prosecutor's office. Tell me what you have in front of you. He read her the form. She was quiet through all of it, and Patricia's quiet was not the quiet of someone processing. It was the quiet of someone who had already processed and was now deciding how to respond. When he finished, she said, Webb moved faster than I expected. That's actually useful information. How is that useful? Tank said. Because people who move fast make mistakes, she said. I need every document you have related to Webb's previous contact with the garage. Every visit, every offer, every communication. Danny's been keeping notes. Tank looked at Danny. Danny held up the notebook. Yes, Tank said. Good. Danny's notebook is now a legal document. Tell him not to add anything retroactively and not to remove anything. I want it exactly as it is. A pause. I also need Sarah in my office this afternoon, not tomorrow, today. Sarah was already nodding before Tank relayed it. They were in Patricia's office at 2 o'clock. It was a small office on the second floor of a building downtown that smelled like old paper and printer ink, with 2 chairs across from Patricia's desk that looked like they'd been chosen specifically for their ability to make people feel they were in a serious room. Patricia was already at her desk when they arrived. She had 3 separate legal pads on the desk, each with its own color of pen. She looked at Sarah the way she had the first time, not unkindly, but with the particular focus of someone who needed information and had no time to waste. "Here's what Webb filed," she said. She slid a copy of a document across the desk. He went through a third-party complaint mechanism, a private citizen filing a welfare concern, which triggers a mandatory prosecutorial review. On paper, it looks like a concerned community member. In practice, it has Marcus Webb's fingerprints on every paragraph. "Can you prove that?" Sarah asked. "Not yet, but the complaint uses specific legal language around zoning classifications that a private citizen would not know without coaching from a property law attorney. That tells me Webb's lawyer drafted it and found someone to file it under their name." Patricia tapped the document. "That matters because if we can establish Webb's direct involvement, the complaint becomes malicious prosecution. That changes the legal landscape considerably." "How long does that take?" Tank said. "Time is the problem," Patricia said. She didn't soften it. "The court date is in 6 weeks. The prosecutor's office has to respond to the welfare complaint within 10 days. That means Carla's department gets pulled back in welfare conducts, a second review, and if that review produces any ambiguity whatsoever, they have the authority to remove Sarah from the premises pending the court date." The word "remove" landed in the room and sat there. Sarah looked at Tank. Tank was looking at the legal pad Patricia was writing on his jaw, set in the way she'd learned meant he was doing the calculation, the real one, the one underneath the immediate problem. "What do we need," he said, "to make sure the welfare review produces no ambiguity?" Patricia looked at him. She clicked her pen twice. "More than we have," she said. "Right now we have documentation of a work arrangement and a registered secondary address. That was enough for an initial review. For a second review conducted under active legal pressure, we need more." She turned to Sarah. "I need everything you can give me, not just the facts of the current arrangement, your history, the prior placement, the incident you described to Carla." Sarah went still. Patricia said, "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that telling that story in a legal proceeding means it becomes part of the record. Other people will read it." "Yes," Sarah said. "You're right, it will. I need you to decide whether that's something you can do." She wasn't pushing. She was genuinely asking. "Because if you can, it becomes our strongest argument. A prior placement with documented welfare concerns that went unreported by the supervising caseworker is exactly the kind of thing that makes a judge look hard at the county's motivation for intervening in a functioning alternative arrangement." Sarah looked at the desk. She looked at her own hands. She thought about the door handle in the dart, about the breakfast table, face about walking out with her duffel bag and choosing the nothing. She thought about the weight of keeping that thing internal, the way it lived in her chest like a stone she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing it most of the time until she did, and then she noticed it completely. She said, "If I tell it, does it help keep the garage open?" Patricia said, "Yes." "Then I'll tell it." Patricia wrote something on the first legal pad. Her face was controlled, but something moved briefly underneath it, the involuntary response of someone who had chosen a profession built on containing exactly this kind of information and still after decades found themselves absorbing it when it mattered. "Okay," she said, "we'll do this right." The welfare review came 8 days later. Carla came back, but not alone this time. She brought a supervisor, a man named Reyes, 50s, gray-haired with the specific energy of someone sent to make a situation harder rather than easier. He walked through the garage with a clipboard and a series of questions that were technically about welfare and practically about liability, and the way he asked them made it clear he was looking for something to use rather than something to understand. Tank answered every question. His voice was steady, his documentation was complete, and he had Patricia's phone number on a laminated card in his vest pocket that he produced precisely when Reyes asked about legal representation. Reyes looked at the card, looked at Tank. "You're well prepared," he said with the tone of someone who considers preparedness suspicious. "I run a business," Tank said. "Preparation is part of it." Sarah's interview was in the break area, just her and Carla Reyes standing at the edge of the room with his clipboard. Sarah had spent 3 days preparing for this with Patricia. Not rehearsing a performance Patricia had been clear about, that had said the worst thing you can do in a legal context is perform rather than testify, because performed answers have a quality that trained interviewers detect immediately. What they'd done instead was work through the facts until Sarah could state them without the facts controlling her, until she owned the narrative rather than the narrative owning her. Carla asked the standard questions first. Living situation, employment, daily schedule, relationship to the adult occupants of the premises. Sarah answered them cleanly without elaborating unnecessarily and without hedging where no hedge was required. Then Reyes said, "Do you feel you can leave the situation if you choose to?" Sarah looked at him. She took one breath. "Yes," she said. "The difference between this situation and my prior placement is that in this situation, I feel I can leave because I'm safe, not because I'm scared." Reyes made a note. Carla made a note. Reyes said, "You're referencing a prior placement. Can you tell me about that?" She told him. All of it this time. The door handle, the breakfast table, the choice to walk out. She told it the same way she'd practiced not performing distress, not suppressing it either, just stating the facts in the sequence they occurred the way you'd tell a mechanic what the car was doing before it stopped working. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Reyes didn't write anything on his clipboard for a long moment. When he did start writing, his hand was moving faster than it had been. Carla said quietly, "That placement, was it documented when you left?" "There was a file open," Sarah said. "I don't know what's in it." "I'll find out," Carla said, not as a threat, as a fact. After they left, Sarah sat in the break area for a few minutes. Big Jim came in without being asked and put a mug of coffee on the table in front of her. He sat down across from her in the chair that was too small for him, which made him look slightly absurd in a way that she found against all logic comforting. "How'd it go?" he said. "I told him everything." Big Jim nodded. He wrapped both hands around his own mug. "That takes something," he said, "telling the hard, true thing when you could tell an easier version of it." "Patricia said it was necessary." "Patricia's right," he said, "but necessary and easy aren't the same thing. You did something hard today." She looked at the mug. She looked at Big Jim. She said, "In Folsom, was there a hard truth thing you had to tell?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had history in it. "Couple of them," he said finally. "The hardest one was telling the parole board that I understood why I was there. Not that I regretted getting caught. Not that I'd changed. That I understood that I could see the whole sequence of choices that put me in that room and account for every one of them." He turned his mug slowly. "Because the easy version is always the version where the world did something to you. The hard version is the one where you did something to the world and you can hold that without falling apart." "Did it work?" Sarah said. "Took 3 hearings," he said. "But yes, it worked." He looked at her steadily. "Yours is going to work too. Because what you said today is the true thing, and the true thing has a weight to it that the other kind doesn't." She drank her coffee. She went back to work. The attack on Tank happened on a Wednesday night. He'd been at Duffy's, a bar 2 miles from the garage that he went to on Wednesday evenings, with a predictability that was in retrospect exactly the kind of pattern you shouldn't have if someone was watching you. He'd been going there for 12 years. He knew everyone in it. He had a usual seat and a usual order, and usually stayed 90 minutes and walked out the same door he'd come in. He walked out at 10:45 and they were waiting in the lot behind. 3 men. Sarah learned the details the next morning from Danny, who'd gotten them from Ghost, who'd gotten them from the emergency room nurse, who'd called the garage at 11:30 because Tank had listed Iron Eagle as his emergency contact. 3 men, one of whom Tank recognized as a former associate of a rival crew they'd had territory trouble with 6 years back, the same crew that Rodriguez's brother Marco had run with, the same crew that had been quiet for years and now apparently wasn't. They'd used bats. Tank had gotten his arm up in time to take the first one there rather than across the skull, which was the reason he was in an examination room rather than a different kind of room. 2 cracked ribs, a broken wrist, cuts across his face from going down on the asphalt. He refused to be admitted. Sarah found this out when Ghost came into the garage at 11:45, 20 minutes after the call, and said simply, "Tank's at County General, he's stable, he's being stubborn." She was already reaching for her jacket. "Sarah," Ghost said. She stopped. "He doesn't want—" He paused, clearly editing something. "He's going to tell you not to come." "I'm aware," she said and walked out. She was in the ER waiting room at midnight. Tank came out of the examination area at 12:30 with his left wrist in a temporary cast and his face cleaned up and 2 ribs wrapped in an expression that oscillated between pain and something that looked embarrassingly like being caught. He stopped when he saw her. I told Ghost not to call you, he said. Ghost called the garage. I decided to come. Those are two different things. She looked at his face. She kept her own face controlled with the specific effort of someone who has learned that showing what they feel at the wrong moment doesn't help anyone. Are you all right? I've been worse. That's not what I asked. He looked at her for a moment. He moved carefully to the chair beside her and sat down with the particular care of someone with cracked ribs, learning the geography of a new pain. I'm all right, he said, more honestly this time. Do you know who they were? One of them. He said the crew name. It meant something to her because she'd heard Ghost mention it once obliquely in the context of the property dispute. A crew that had been hired muscle before and apparently still was. Webb, she said. Can't prove it. Not yet. He looked at her sideways. His right eye was swollen enough to narrow his vision on that side, and he had to turn his head slightly to compensate. You sound like Patricia. I've been spending time with Patricia. He made a sound that was almost a laugh and immediately regretted it for what it did to his ribs. Danny arrived at 12:45 with Ghost and Big Jim, all three of them coming through the ER door, with the quiet efficiency of people who did not panic but also did not stay home. Big Jim assessed Tank's face with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen this before and said, could have been worse. That seems to be the consensus, Tank said. You need to stay somewhere tonight, Ghost said. Not alone. I'll be fine at the PM. Tank, Ghost's voice was flat and absolute, not aggressive, just completely immovable. You have cracked ribs and a broken wrist, and you were hit 3 times in the head. You're not staying alone tonight. A silence. The cot's free, Sarah said. Everyone looked at her. She looked back. At the garage, the cot in the storage area. I'll sleep in the car. The car works now. She said it simply without making it a big thing because making it a big thing would have made Tank refuse it on principle. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him weighing the options against the pain. Fine, he said. Big Jim drove. Ghost rode with them. Danny stayed to manage the morning schedule, which Danny could manage better than most people twice his age because Danny had a mind that was built for logistics and knew it. They were back at the garage at 1:15. Sarah set up the cot properly, found the extra blanket she'd been keeping in the storage area, made sure Tank had water and the prescription pain medication the ER had sent him with. She did all of it efficiently and without commentary. When she was done, Tank said from the cot, You don't have to. I know, she said. Good night, Tank. She went to the car. She sat in the driver's seat and looked at the garage wall and thought about the sequence of events, Webb's visit, the court date, the welfare review, and now this, and the way they were accelerating. 3 directions at once, Tank had said. She thought about what the third direction might be, the one he'd said was going to surprise them. She found out the next morning. A local news website had posted a story at 6 a.m. She saw it on her phone while the coffee was heating on the hot plate. The headline read, Minor found living at Hell's Angels garage amid ongoing legal investigation. The story named the garage. It named Tank by his legal name and his road name. It referenced the court date. It referenced the welfare investigation. It did not name Sarah. She was a minor and couldn't be named, but it described her in enough detail that anyone who knew her would have no trouble identifying her. The story also had a quote from an anonymous source described as, a community member with knowledge of the situation, who said, these men have serious criminal records. The presence of a vulnerable teenager in this environment raises real questions about the oversight of the county welfare system. The anonymous source was not anonymous to Sarah. The phrasing, the structure of it, the specific word vulnerable deployed as a label rather than a fact had the same fingerprints as the regulatory complaint language Patricia had identified. She walked into the garage at 5 a.m. Ghost and Danny were already there. She showed them the screen. Ghost read it without expression. Danny read it and put it down and opened his notebook and started writing. Does Tank know? Ghost said. Not yet. He was still asleep when I came in. Ghost picked up his phone. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put it back down. Let him sleep another hour, he said. The ribs are bad. The story's going to spread, Sarah said. Yes. It's going to bring attention to the garage. More police, more county, more. Yes, Ghost said again. He looked at her with those pale eyes that held everything tightly, but lets you see that there was something held. Sarah, we've had attention before. We know how to handle attention. This is different, she said, because of me. Ghost was quiet for a moment. Then he said, can I tell you something? Yes. 6 years ago, I came back from my second tour in pretty bad shape, he said. It was the most personal thing she'd ever heard him say, and she went completely still, afraid that moving would stop it. I was not in a good place. I was not making good decisions. I ended up in this garage because Tank found me at a VA appointment and saw something he recognized and asked if I wanted work. He paused. The attention that brought at the time from people who didn't understand what Tank was doing, who thought he was taking advantage of a situation, that attention was bad. It was a hard year, but we went through it. He picked up his wrench. This is the same thing. You're here because someone saw something worth seeing. The attention is the cost of that. We've paid this kind of cost before. She looked at the workbench for a moment. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. Hand me the 7/16. She found the socket. She handed it across. She went to start her shift. Tank woke up at 6:30. He read the news story sitting on the cot with his broken wrist in his lap and his face doing the controlled neutral thing that Sarah now knew was the external layer over something that ran very deep. When he was done, he set the phone down and sat with it for a minute. Then he called Patricia. Patricia picked up on the first ring, which told Sarah that Patricia had already seen it. I know, Patricia said. I've been waiting for you to call. How bad? Tank said. Manageable, Patricia said. The story doesn't have facts we don't have answers for. What it does is create a public narrative that Webb can leverage to add community pressure to the legal case. That means our next move is more important than our last one. A brief pause. Tank, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without reacting. Tell me. The prosecutor's office called me this morning at 5:45. They're adding a charge to the zoning case, contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The garage went quiet. Sarah watched Tank's face. She watched the controlled neutral hold crack slightly at the edges and hold again. On what basis, he said. His voice was perfectly even. On the basis that providing an unregistered residential arrangement for a minor in proximity to a registered criminal enterprise constitutes contributing to a minor's delinquency under state statute. Patricia's voice was equally controlled. It's an aggressive reading of the statute. It's also not without legal basis, which is why Webb's attorney chose it. Big Jim had appeared in the doorway again. He looked at Tank's face and didn't speak. What does it mean for the court date? Tank said. It means the stakes at the hearing are significantly higher. Zoning violations carry fines. Contributing to the delinquency of a minor can carry jail time. A pause, and for the first time, Patricia let a small edge of her actual feelings show through the professional register. I want to be honest with you because you've always been honest with me. This is a serious charge. Webb wants you off this property, and he's found a way to make fighting it expensive and dangerous. We're going to fight it anyway, but I need you to know what we're fighting. Tank looked across the garage at Sarah. Sarah looked back at him. She said clearly enough for the phone to pick up. Tell Patricia we're not settling. A beat of silence. Patricia said, Is that Sarah? Yes, Tank said. Good, Patricia said. The edge of something almost like warmth came into her voice. Tell her I agree. The week between that call and the court date was the hardest week Sarah had lived through since her mother died, and she had lived through some genuinely terrible weeks. The news story had done what Webb intended it to do. People called the garage, some of them angry, some of them concerned in the performative way of people who wanted to register concern without doing anything about it. Some of them journalists who left messages that nobody returned. 2 customers canceled service appointments. One of them left a voicemail saying he didn't want his bike worked on by criminals who preyed on children, which Big Jim listened to once and then deleted without comment, though his jaw was tight for the rest of the morning. Rodriguez came by twice. The first time was official. He had a follow-up form from the prosecutor's office that Tank signed in front of him while Patricia listened on speakerphone. The second time was not official. He came in the late afternoon out of uniform and asked if he could talk to Sarah alone. She said yes. They stood outside by the side door where she'd knocked on her first morning. Rodriguez said, I've been doing some checking. The 3 men from the parking lot at Duffy's. I know one of them professionally. Marco's crew, Sarah said. He looked at her. He didn't seem surprised that she'd made the connection. 2 years ago, Webb's development group hired that crew for what was logged as security consulting, he said. The log is real. I pulled it. Can you prove the Wednesday night was connected? Not officially. I don't have the authority to open that investigation myself. He paused. But I know someone who does, a detective in the organized crime division who's been building a file on Webb's development operation for 18 months. I spoke to him this morning. Sarah looked at Rodriguez. She thought about the gas station the first time he had stopped her. She thought about his face in the ER waiting room when he'd said, I didn't file it. Why are you doing this? She said. He looked at the wall. He looked back at her. Because I've been watching that garage for 2 years, he said. And in 2 years, I have not once seen anything that resembles what people say about it. I've seen men work. I've seen men show up. He paused. And then I saw you show up, and the way they handled that, and I thought, he stopped. What? She said. I thought Marco would have told me I was wrong about them, he said. And I thought maybe he was the one who was wrong. She looked at him for a long moment. What does the detective need? He needs someone who can testify to Webb's direct contact with the garage and his statements about the property. The offers the implied threats. In a separate proceeding, not your court date, a different investigation. He looked at her steadily. That would be Danny's notebook, and your account of Webb's 2 visits. Sarah was quiet. I know it's more exposure, Rodriguez said. I know you're all ready. No, she said. It's not that. She pressed her lips together for a moment. I'm thinking about how to tell Tank. He's going to want to decide. That's fair, Rodriguez said. She told Tank that evening, sitting in the garage after everyone else had left. His wrist was elevated. His ribs were making him breathe carefully, and his face in the dim light looked tired in a way she didn't usually see on him. Not defeated, but the kind of tired that accumulates from holding something heavy for a long time without putting it down. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for almost a full minute. Then he said, if we give the detective what he needs, the case against us potentially becomes leverage in a larger investigation, which means it either gets buried while they build the bigger case or it becomes part of it. Yes. Either way, we lose control of the timeline. Yes, she said. But, he said, he already knew the rest. But if Webb is connected to what happened to you on Wednesday night, the only way that becomes part of the official record is through this channel, she said. And if it's not in the official record, he gets to do it again. Tank looked at his broken wrist. He turned it slightly, testing the range of motion inside the cast. Call Rodriguez back, he said. Sarah took out her phone. Sarah, Tank said. She looked up. His face had the tired in it still, but underneath the tired was something that had been there since the first morning, the thing she'd seen in him before she'd had a word for it. The quality that made him walk out of a VA waiting room toward a man who needed work rather than away from him. The quality that had made Walter Briggs hold a garage door open for a 16-year-old from South Phoenix 40 years ago. You held together this week, he said, under things that would have broken a lot of people. I want you to know I see it. She kept her face even. I learned it from watching you, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked away at the bikes in the back corner, at the tools on the walls, at all of it. Make the call, he said. She made the call. The detective's name was Harlan Briggs. Sarah caught the last name first, Briggs, and felt something move through her before she'd consciously processed why. Then she remembered. Walter Briggs, the man who'd held the door open for a 16-year-old Tank in North Phoenix 40 years ago. She didn't say anything. She filed it. Harlan Briggs, Briggs was 53, built lean with the kind of face that had settled into permanent watchfulness. Not suspicious exactly, but attentive, in the way of someone who'd spent 3 decades noticing what people did when they thought nobody was watching. He came to the garage the morning after Rodriguez's call alone in a car that was deliberately unremarkable. He shook Tank's good hand, nodded to Ghost Big Jim and Danny in turn, and then he sat down at the break table and looked at Sarah for a moment before he said anything. Rodriguez says you're the one who decided to make the call, he said. Tank decided, Sarah said. Rodriguez says you decided, Briggs repeated, not rudely, just firmly, the way of a man who'd learned that precision about who did what mattered more than politeness. Sarah looked at Tank. Tank's face was neutral. She looked back at Briggs. Yes, she said, I decided. Briggs nodded once. Good, that means you understand the stakes. People who understand the stakes are easier to work with than people who figure them out later. He put a folder on the table. I've been building a file on Marcus Webb for 18 months. What Webb does is not illegal on its face. He's a developer. Development involves pressure. Pressure is not a crime. What makes it a crime is when the pressure includes coordinating physical violence against people who won't self-filing fraudulent third-party complaints to generate legal exposure, and paying men with criminal records to do both of those things while maintaining deniability. He looked at Tank's cast. Wednesday night moved the file from civil to criminal, but I need the connective tissue. Danny's notebook, Tank said. Danny's notebook, Briggs confirmed. He looked at Danny. Every visit, every statement, every implied threat. Danny reached into his chest pocket. He put the notebook on the table with the care of someone putting down something irreplaceable. It's all in there, he said. Dates, times, exact words where I was certain. Paraphrase noted as paraphrase. I flagged anything I wasn't 100% on. Briggs picked it up. He opened it. He read for 2 minutes without speaking. His expression didn't change, but he turned the pages with a slowness that meant he was reading carefully rather than skimming. He closed it. He looked at Danny. You taught yourself to read at 22, he said. Danny went still. Rodriguez told you that. Rodriguez told me that. I'm telling you that this Briggs tapped. The notebook is better documentation than I get from half the professional investigators I work with. The flagging system alone. Where'd you learn that? Danny looked at the table. Ghost said if you're not sure about something, say you're not sure. That way the things you are sure about mean something. Briggs looked at Ghost. Ghost looked back at him without any particular expression. Okay, Briggs said. He turned back to the full room. Here's what happens next. The notebook goes with me as evidence, which means Danny gets a copy made right now before I leave. Sarah, I need a written account of both of Webb's visits to this garage, what he said in sequence, as exactly as you can reconstruct it. Not today. Patricia Oakes' office in her presence, so it's properly witnessed. He closed the folder. The court date on the zoning and welfare charges is in 6 days. I cannot promise you that what I do will affect that timeline. What I can tell you is that I'm going to make a call to the prosecutor's office today, and the call is going to let them know that their case against this garage is built on the activities of a man currently under organized crime investigation. The room absorbed that. Big Jim said slowly, does that make them drop the case? It makes them think very carefully about how hard they want to prosecute it, Briggs said. Prosecutors don't love being associated with the losing side of an investigation that becomes public. If they think Webb's going down, they don't want to be holding his briefcase when it happens. And if they don't think he's going down, Sarah said. Briggs looked at her. He had the quality she thought of someone who'd been asked hard questions so many times that he'd stopped flinching at them. Then we go to court, he said, and we fight it the way Patricia fights things, which based on her reputation means the other side doesn't enjoy the experience. Patricia, who had arrived 6 minutes into the conversation and had been standing near the door with her legal pad, made no response to this, which was itself a kind of response. Danny made 3 copies of the notebook on the gas station's photocopier, 2 for the file, 1 for himself, and Briggs left with the original, and a handshake that felt more like a contract than a social gesture. Patricia stayed another 40 minutes reviewing the timeline of events with Tank and producing a list of 11 specific items she needed before the hearing in 6 days. She handed the list to Sarah. Sarah looked at it. Why me? Because you have the clearest head in this room right now, Patricia said without sentimentality. Tank's in pain, and he's angry, which means his judgment is sound, but his patience is short. Ghost and Jim and Danny will do anything you ask, but they need someone to ask. You're going to ask. I'm 17, Sarah said. Yes, Patricia said, and you've handled more in the last month than most adults handle in a year. Are we going to argue about this, or are we going to work? Sarah looked at the list. 11 items. Half of them she could start on immediately, 3 required. Tank's signature, 2 required Ghost mechanical records going back 18 months. We're going to work, she said. They worked. The next 6 days were the most organized chaos Sarah had ever moved through. She drove to Patricia's office, twice to the county records building once, and to the garage of a man named Pete Weston, the customer whose bike was in Bay 3, the one Webb had asked about, who turned out to be both willing and emphatic about providing a written statement confirming the legitimate nature of his business with Iron Eagle. Pete Weston was 64, a retired electrician with a gray ponytail and 20 years of history with the garage. And when Sarah explained what was happening, his response was to say, "You tell me what you need and I'll be there," with the absolute simplicity of someone who had decided and was done deciding. She told Danny to note it. Danny noted it. Ghost produced 18 months of maintenance records, organized, dated, cross-referenced against invoices with the same focused precision he applied to everything mechanical. He put them in a folder and handed the folder to Sarah and said, "The invoices match the parts receipts. Everything's there." She checked 3 of them at random, comparing invoices to receipts. They matched perfectly. "Ghost," she said. He looked up. "Have you always kept records this carefully?" He considered the question as if it were a technical one, requiring an accurate answer. "Since Patricia told me to 7 years ago," he said. "She said the way you keep records is the way you tell the world what kind of operation you're running. I decided what kind I wanted to tell it." She carried the folder to Patricia's office the next morning. The night before the hearing, Tank called everyone into the garage. Not a formal meeting. He didn't use those words. He just said, "Come in back," and they came. He stood with his cast arm at his side and his ribs still making him move carefully, and his face carrying everything from the last 6 days, and he looked at each of them in turn. "Tomorrow's going to be in public," he said. "The news story already made it that. There'll be people in that courtroom who came to see the bikers get what they deserve. I need you to know that going in." He paused. "What I also need you to know is what we're walking in there with. 18 months of clean records, a welfare review that cleared, a client testimonial, a detective from organized crime who's made a phone call to the prosecutor's office, and Patricia Oakes, who has not lost a civil case in 4 years." Big Jim said, "What about the criminal charge, the delinquency charge?" "Patricia says it's their weakest case and their most aggressive play," Tank said. "She says aggressive plays are what people make when they don't have the ground under them they think they have." "And if she's wrong," Big Jim said. "Not worried, just asking." Tank looked up at him. "Then we deal with it." Big Jim nodded. That was enough. Tank looked at Sarah last. He looked at her for a long moment with the complicated expression she'd learned to read as him, carrying something he wanted to say carefully. "None of this lands on you tomorrow," he said. "Whatever happens in that room. None of it is your fault and none of it is your responsibility. You understand me?" "I'm testifying," she said. "I know. That's not the same thing as it being your responsibility." She looked at him. She thought about what he'd said on the very first morning, "Inside this garage, we protect each other. No exceptions." She thought about how that sentence had sounded to her then foreign theoretical, the kind of thing that sounded good and probably meant something narrower in practice. She thought about how it sounded to her now. "Tank," she said. "Yeah, I know it's not my fault," she said. "But it's also, I want you to know that I want to be there, not because Patricia told me to testify, and not because I feel responsible, because you held that door open, and I want to be in that room." He looked at her for a long time. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. Nobody slept much that night. The courtroom was smaller than Sarah had expected, which made it feel more contained and somehow more serious. A small room where things that mattered were going to happen in close quarters. Patricia was already at the defense table when they arrived, legal pads and a lined pen in hand, wearing a different blazer than usual. That was slightly more formal without being theatrical about it. The prosecutor was a man named Alderton, late 30s, careful in his movements with the air of someone who had prepared thoroughly and was now privately recalculating something based on a phone call he'd received. Sarah watched him when he came in. She watched him look at their table, then at Patricia, then at the documentation stacked neatly beside Patricia's pads. She watched something move through his expression that was brief but readable. He'd gotten Briggs's call. He was reconsidering. The judge was a woman named Calloway, 60s, sharp, with the particular efficiency of someone who had no patience for theatrics, but complete patience for facts. She reviewed the docket summary, looked at both tables, and said, "Counselors, I understand there have been some developments in the last 48 hours. I'd like to address those before we proceed with opening statements." Patricia stood. "Your Honor, the defense has been made aware through appropriate channels that the complainant in the third-party welfare filing is the subject of an active organized crime investigation. We have a sworn statement from the investigating detective to that effect which we're submitting to the court. She placed the statement on the clerk's desk. We contend that the charges before the court today are not independent civic concerns, but instruments of a coordinated pressure campaign against this property and its operators. Alderton stood. The prosecution, he stopped. He looked at his own notes. He started again. The prosecution is prepared to address the zoning matter. With respect to the contributing to delinquency charge, the prosecution requests a continuance pending review of what Mr. Alderton, Judge Calloway said. A brief silence. The kind of silence that happens when someone has run out of the version of events they came in with. Pending review of new information, Alderton said. His voice was controlled, but something under it wasn't. Judge Calloway looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has heard this particular phrase used in this particular way many times before. The court will take a 30-minute recess, she said. Counselors, my chambers. The gavel came down. Patricia stood collected one legal pad and walked to the judge's chambers without looking back at the defense table. Alderton followed, his jaw set. The room rearranged itself into the low murmur of a courtroom during recess. Sarah sat between Tank and Big Jim. Ghost was directly behind her. Danny had his notebook open, but wasn't writing. He was just holding it the way you hold something that anchors you. Pete Weston was 3 rows back. He'd come without being asked beyond the written statement, had simply called the garage the night before and said, "What time do I need to be there?" He was wearing a button-down shirt he'd clearly ironed, which moved Sarah in a way she hadn't expected. Tank said quietly, "You okay?" "Yes," she said. My ribs hurt." "That's not what I asked." He made the almost laugh sound, controlled it for the ribs. "I'm okay," he said. "Whatever happens next, I'm okay." What happened next took 19 minutes. Patricia came out of the chambers first. She walked directly to the defense table, set her legal pad down, and said quietly enough for just their table to hear, "The delinquency charge is being dropped. The prosecutor is requesting a 60-day continuance on the zoning matter pending the outcome of the organized crime investigation." Tank said, Meaning they're not going forward today," Patricia said. "They need 60 days to figure out whether they want to be on the record prosecuting a case that their primary complainant may be indicted for constructing." Big Jim said very low, "So we won." "Today we won," Patricia said. She was precise about it, not to dampen the room, but because precision was how she communicated. The zoning matter is not dismissed, it's continued. That means it can be recalendared. But with the investigation active and Briggs building his case, the likelihood of Alderton's office wanting to recalendar, it gets smaller every day. She looked at Tank. "This is a very good day. It is not the last day." Tank nodded. He turned to look at the people behind him. At Ghost, who had come to a VA appointment, broken, and found something worth being fixed for. At Big Jim, who had spent 7 years learning the hardest version of the truth and come out knowing how to hold it. At Danny, who had taught himself to read so he could understand the things that mattered and had written everything down in a notebook that had turned out to matter enormously. At Pete Weston in his iron shirt. Tank said nothing. He didn't need to. The look was enough, and everyone at that table knew it. Judge Calloway returned to the bench. She announced the prosecutorial decisions in formal language that reduced the last 6 weeks to 3 sentences. The delinquency charge dropped, the zoning matter, continued, the case adjourned. The gavel came down. Sarah sat in the chair for a moment after everyone else began moving. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the front of the room, and she let the last 6 weeks move through her like a current. The cold walk to the garage in the dark, the coffee mug, the sleeping bag on the cot, the door handle in the dark, and how she'd told it out loud, the newspaper story. Tank's broken wrist, Rodriguez in the parking lot, Briggs, and the notebook, Patricia, in her chambers for 19 minutes. Big Jim's hand landed on her shoulder, same as it had in the break area after the welfare review. One solid, brief contact. "Come on," he said. "We're going to get coffee." She stood up. She was steady on her feet. They got coffee at the diner 2 blocks from the courthouse. All 5 of them, plus Pete Weston, who turned out to be a man who told stories about motorcycle engines with the same warmth other men use for grandchildren. The diner was not big enough for their table comfortably, and nobody cared. Tank sat at the head of the table with his cast in his lap, drinking coffee he could hold in his good hand. And at one point, Weston said something that made him laugh, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind that doesn't calculate what it costs. Sarah watched him. She thought about the version of this morning she'd imagined during the worst nights of the last 6 weeks. The version where the charges stuck, where the county stepped in, where she was moved to another placement, and the garage was fined into closing, and all of it was dismantled by a man with a glossy business card who decided that other people's lives were acceptable collateral for a commercial corridor. She'd been able to imagine that version with terrible clarity at 3 a.m. This version was harder to hold. Not because it wasn't real, but because it was, and real good things required a different kind of adjustment than real bad ones. She was still adjusting when Tank looked down the table at her and said, "Stop thinking so hard." "I'm not." "You're sitting there with that look you get," he said, "like you're trying to figure out if this is real." She looked at him. "How do you know that look?" "Because I had it for about 2 years after Walter Briggs gave me that job," he said. "Every morning I'd show up and something would be okay, and I'd spend half the day waiting for the part where it stopped being okay." He turned his mug slowly. It didn't stop. "How long until you believe that?" He thought about it. "About 6 months," he said. "And then one morning I just didn't wait anymore. I just showed up." He looked at her steadily. "You're going to get there." She drank her coffee. Around the table, the conversation moved the way it moved when people who'd been through something together come out the other side, still intact, loose, warm, punctuated by the particular laughter of relief. Danny was writing something in his copied notebook. Ghost was listening with the focused attention he gave everything worth listening to. Big Jim was in the middle of the Folsom story that somehow always ended up being funny, despite the fact that nothing about Folsom was actually funny. Sarah's phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a number she didn't recognize, which normally she'd ignore. But the first line was visible in the preview. "This is Harlan Briggs. Webb was picked up this morning." She set the phone face up on the table. The conversation around her continued for exactly 3 seconds before Tank glanced down and read the preview and went still. Then Ghost read it. Then Big Jim stopped mid-sentence. Danny leaned over and read it. He opened his notebook. He wrote the date and time, and then he wrote Webb picked up, 11:47 a.m. He underlined it once. Pete Weston looked around the table at all of them. "What happened?" "The man who filed the charges against the garage," Sarah said, "got arrested this morning." Weston sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Tank. "You know," he said, "I've been bringing bikes to you for 20 years and I've never once seen you surprised." Tank looked at the phone. He looked up at the diner ceiling. He let out a breath, long and deliberate, the breath of a man setting down something he'd been carrying at an angle that hurt. "I'm a little surprised," he said. The table was quiet for one beat. Then Big Jim laughed, the laugh that was too big for any room. And this time, in this particular room, it fit exactly right. Carla from County Welfare called that afternoon. She'd heard about the dropped charges before Sarah had a chance to tell her, which meant the information had moved fast through channels Sarah didn't fully understand and probably didn't need to. Her voice on the phone was different than it had been in the garage or at the formal reviews, more direct, less mediated by the professional register. "I found the file from your prior placement," she said. "The one that should have documented your departure." A pause. "It was incomplete. What should have been in it wasn't." "I know," Sarah said. "I want you to know that it's been referred internally," Carla said. "What happened in that house? It's being looked at." Sarah sat with that for a moment. She'd told the story 3 times in the last 6 weeks, to Patricia, to Carla's original review, to the formal record. Each telling had been different, easier than the last, the stone in her chest diminishing by some increment each time. She thought about the foster mother's face. She thought about the choice to walk out with the duffel bag. "Thank you," she said. "I also want to tell you something else," Carla said. "The second review, the one Reyes came with me for. His report came back to my supervisor this morning. His recommendation was that the arrangement at Iron Eagle represented, quote, a stable and supportive environment that adequately meets the subject's welfare needs." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Reyes said that," she said. "He did." Carla paused. "He's not a bad man. He came in with the wrong frame. You gave him a better one." After the call, Sarah walked back into the garage. The afternoon shift was running, Ghost on a client bike, Danny sorting the afternoon's parts delivery, Big Jim on the phone with someone who needed a quote on a restoration. Tank was at the workbench with his good hand doing what he could one-handed, which turned out to be more than most people could do with two. He looked up when she came in. He read her face the way he'd been reading it since the first morning. "Good call," he said. "Rhea's report cleared us," she said. "The welfare file is officially closed." Tank set down what he was holding. He looked at his good hand for a moment, then at the price, then at the garage, at all of it, the way you look at something you almost lost and can now see without the shadow of almost losing it. He said, "Patricia's getting to want to celebrate." "Patricia doesn't celebrate," Sarah said. "She moves to the next item on the list." "That's celebrating for Patricia." Sarah laughed. It was a real one, full the kind she hadn't had much occasion for in the last year and a half. Ghost looked up from his workstation. Danny stopped sorting and looked at her. Big Jim's voice on the phone went briefly quiet. The sound of it moved through the garage like something returning to a room it had been missing from. Tank looked at her. His expression was the complicated, quiet one, the one she'd seen the first time she'd said she wasn't going anywhere, the one that lived underneath the controlled neutral and only surfaced when he let his guard down far enough to let something real through. He said, "I'm going to say something, and you're going to all think to yak with me about it." "Probably," she said. "You saved this place," he said. "Not me, not Patricia, not Briggs's investigation. The moment you walked through that door at 5 in the morning and told Carla the true thing and told the court the true thing, that's what this turned on. The truth you were willing to tell in a room full of people who didn't start out believing you." She looked at him. She looked around the garage at Ghost and Danny and Big Jim, at the bikes in the back corner, at the cot in the storage area, and the tools on the walls, and the space heater in the corner doing its best. "I want to argue with you," she said. "I know. But I'm not going to," she said, "because you told me about Walter Briggs and I understood something. That this place is the thing he did that kept going. That the thing you do keeps going too, and I got to be part of it." She paused. "So maybe we both did it." Tank looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe we both did it," he said. She went to start the afternoon work. Her work in her place in the garage that had held the door open when everything else had closed. The zoning continuance expired without being recalendared. Patricia called Tank on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the hearing to tell him and Tank related to the garage the same way he relayed everything without drama, just the facts sitting in the air for everyone to absorb at their own pace. The prosecutor's office had let the deadline pass. No refiling, no notice, no explanation. The case was dead. Danny wrote the date in his notebook. He didn't underline it. He didn't need to. What followed was not a celebration in any conventional sense. There was no party, no announcement, no moment where everyone stopped and acknowledged that something significant had concluded. What there was instead was a Tuesday morning where the garage opened at 5 a.m. the same as always, and the work started the same as always, and somewhere in the middle of the first hour, Sarah realized that the particular weight she'd been carrying since the night Tank came home from Duffy's with a broken wrist had lifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way weight lifts when you've been holding something so long, you stop noticing it, and then one morning you put it down, and your arms remember what they felt like before. She was on her back under a client bike when she noticed it. Just gone. The tension that had lived in her chest for 6 weeks, the constant low hum of what comes next, the monitoring of every sound from outside the garage door. Gone. She finished what she was doing, slid out and sat up on the creeper. Ghost was across the bay doing what Ghost always did. Danny was at the parts table. Big Jim was on the phone in the back. She said to nobody in particular, "It's over." Ghost looked up. He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. Then he went back to work. That was enough. Sarah's 18th birthday came on a Thursday in March, 4 months after she'd walked through the side door of Iron Eagle for the first time. She had not announced it. She had no particular tradition around it. Her mother had always made a cake yellow with chocolate frosting, but that was a different life, and she'd learned not to pull on those threads without being ready for what unraveled. She came in at 5 a.m., same as always. The garage was dark when she unlocked it, which was unusual. Ghost was always there before her. She reached for the light switch. They'd gotten there early to set it up. Not elaborate. These were not elaborate men. But on the workbench where she usually kept her cleaning supplies, someone had put a yellow cake with chocolate frosting and 5 candles already lit, which meant they'd been timing her arrival, which meant Ghost had been watching for her headlights. Big Jim was standing with his arms crossed and the expression of a man trying not to look pleased with himself. Danny had his notebook closed, which was how she knew this was a moment he wanted to be in rather than record. Ghost was near the workbench, leaning against the wall, as still as always, watching her with the quiet attention he gave everything worth watching. Tank was standing in the middle of all of it, his cast gone now, both arms at his sides, wearing his usual vest. He said, "We asked around, yellow with chocolate frosting." She stood in the doorway and did not trust herself to speak for a full 5 seconds. "Who told you?" she managed. "Carla," Tank said. "She asked what she could do. That's what she did." She thought about Carla calling Carla back, and Carla, of all people, finding that piece of information and passing it along, and what that meant about the last 4 months and the way things change when you aren't watching them change. "I'm not going to cry," Sarah said. "Nobody said you were," Big Jim said. She cried for about 45 seconds. Nobody said anything. Big Jim handed her a shop rag, which was what passed for a tissue at Iron Eagle, and she took it and used it and then pulled herself back together with the efficiency she'd developed for exactly this kind of situation. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Tank said. They ate cake at 5:15 in the morning in the garage with the space heater going and the bikes in the back and the tools on the walls, and it was the best birthday Sarah had experienced since the last one her mother had been alive for. And she understood, without anyone saying it, that this was the point, not the cake, not the candles, but the fact that 5 people who had no obligation to remember had remembered anyway. That was the day she understood bone deep in past argument that she was not a guest here. She was not a recipient of charity. She was not a pressure point or a problem or a ward of anyone's conscience. She was home. The mechanics certification program was Ghost's idea. He raised it a week after her birthday on a Saturday, the same day of the week he had first started teaching her what the sounds meant. They were working on a Sportster that had come in with an electrical fault nobody had been able to diagnose, and Sarah had been the one to find it a grounding issue so subtle it had escaped 2 previous shops by listening the way Ghost had taught her, by isolating and eliminating in sequence until what was left was the truth. Ghost had watched her do it without saying anything. When she was done and the bike was running clean, he'd said, "You could test for certification." She'd looked at him. Mechanics certification. ASE. Automotive Service Excellence. They have a motorcycle specialization. You have the knowledge base. You need the formal credential. He paused. It opens things. Things like what? Things like being able to work anywhere, he said. Not just here, anywhere you wanted. She looked at him. The weight of what he wasn't saying was significant. Ghost never wasted a sentence, which meant that sentence was carrying more than its apparent meaning. He was telling her that she deserved options, that belonging somewhere shouldn't mean being limited to it. She said, "Would you help me study?" He said, "That's why I mentioned it." She signed up for the exam 6 weeks later. She studied every evening on the same cot in the back of the garage where she'd slept through the worst of the winter, going through the ASE study materials with Ghost on Saturdays and on her own the rest of the week. Ghost taught the way he did everything with precise language and no tolerance for imprecision, but with a patience underneath it that was absolute. He never moved past something until she had it. He never told her she was wrong without telling her exactly where the wrong turn was. She took the exam on a Wednesday morning in April. She drove herself. She did not tell anyone she was nervous because she had learned that naming the things sometimes gave it more room than it deserved. She passed. First attempt score in the 93rd percentile. She drove back to the garage and walked in and hung her jacket on the hook and said without preamble, 93rd percentile. Ghost looked up from his workstation. Something moved through his expression, the brief controlled version of what would have been a full response in someone who operated differently. "Good," he said. Big Jim, who was in the back, let out a sound that was not brief or controlled at all. Danny wrote it in his notebook. She saw him write it and she saw him underline it twice, which was the highest notation in Danny's system, reserved for things he considered genuinely important. Tank came out of the office. He'd started spending more time in the office in the last month, managing what had become a significantly expanded customer list, because the news coverage that Webb had intended to damage them had instead, in the complicated way that public attention sometimes works, generated more business from people who'd read the story and drawn the opposite conclusion from the one Webb intended. He came out and he looked at her and she held up the certification card. He took it from her. He looked at it for a long time. Ghost said you'd pass first try, he said. Ghost told you. Ghost tells me things he thinks I need to know, Tank said. He thought I needed to know that. He handed the card back. Patricia wants to talk to you about something. When you have time. About what? She'll tell you. She called Patricia that afternoon. Patricia picked up on the first ring, same as always, and said, the county community college has a continuing education partnership with 3 automotive shops in the area. They place students for work-study credit. I spoke with the director of the program yesterday. She wants to know if Iron Eagle would consider being a placement site. Sarah sat down on the bench. A placement site. 3 students per semester. You'd work alongside the existing staff. Ghost would be the primary supervisor. Patricia paused. The director also mentioned that the program has a scholarship fund for students who cross over from the work-study track to the full degree program. She asked me to pass along that you would be a strong candidate. The word scholarship sat in the air. Sarah said, Patricia, yes. Did you set this up? A brief pause. I may have made some calls, Patricia said. I may have mentioned that the garage had a newly certified mechanic who was also a minor who'd navigated a welfare investigation and a legal proceeding and come out the other side with her documentation in order and her testimony accurate in every particular. Another pause. The director found that interesting. Sarah pressed her free hand flat against the workbench. She looked at the garage around her, at the tools and the bikes and the cot in the back and the hook where her jacket hung. She said, I want to talk to Tank before I say yes to anything. Of course, Patricia said. That's why I'm calling you, not him. She found Tank in the office. She told him what Patricia had said. He listened, leaning back in the desk chair, with his arms crossed, the way he listened to things he was taking seriously. When she finished, he said, what do you want? I want to know what you think first. What I think, he said, is that a college degree in automotive technology combined with an ASC certification and 3 years of hands-on work produces someone who can run a shop, not just work in one. He looked at her steadily. I also think that if we're taking work-study students, we need someone who knows this place well enough to show them what it actually is, not just the mechanics, what it is. She understood what he was saying. You're asking me to stay. I'm saying that if you stay, there's a role here that didn't exist before you. And if you leave, you'd be qualified to do whatever you want. He spread his hand slightly. Both of those things are true, and I'm not telling you one is better than the other. She looked at him. She thought about all the versions of her future she'd been unable to imagine from the back seat of the dead car on Route 9. She thought about the one that was becoming visible now. I'm not leaving, she said. I'm also going to get the degree. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, those aren't in conflict. No, she said, they're not. The first work-study student arrived in September. His name was Caleb. He was 19 out of the group home system, with the specific combination of wariness and hunger that Sarah recognized from her own first morning, the person who wants something badly enough to walk toward what scares them. He came through the side door the same way she had at 5 in the morning, and he stood in the entrance and looked at Ghost and Big Jim and Danny and didn't say anything. Sarah came around the corner from the parts area. She looked at him. He looked at her. You're the mechanic, he said. He sounded surprised, which she'd been warned to expect, and had decided not to take personally. I'm one of them, she said. You're Caleb. Yeah. Come in, she said. It's cold. He came in. She handed him a mug of coffee. He took it with both hands, the way people take things when they've been cold for a long time. She watched him look around the garage, at the bikes, at the tools at Ghost, already working at his station at Danny, with his notebook at Big Jim's coffee sitting on the parts shelf. She said, first week you watch, second week you assist, third week you start making decisions, and I tell you when you're wrong and why. She looked at him directly. That work for you? He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, the wariness adjusting to accommodate a situation that wasn't what he'd prepared for. Yeah, he said, that works. Good. She picked up her own coffee. Ghost is going to make you feel stupid sometimes. He doesn't mean it as cruelty. He means it is accuracy. The difference matters. Caleb looked at Ghost back. Okay, he said. Big Jim talks a lot, she said. Listen to all of it. About half of it is useful and you won't know which half until later. She paused. Danny keeps a notebook. When you see him write something down, remember what just happened. Those are the things worth remembering. Caleb was looking at her differently now. How long have you worked here? 10 months, she said. And before that, she looked at him. She thought about how to answer. She thought about the version that was easier and the version that was true. Before that, I was sleeping in a dead car on Route 9, she said. And before that, I was in a foster placement. I had to leave. He went still. I'm telling you that, she said, because I want you to know I understand what it took to walk through that door this morning. And I want you to know that the walking through is the thing. Everything else comes from that. Caleb looked at the coffee mug. He looked at the floor. He looked back at her. Does it get better, he said, not performing vulnerability, asking an honest question because he needed an honest answer. Yes, she said, without hesitation, without qualification, because she had earned the right to say it without either. He nodded. He drank his coffee. Tank came in at 5:30, same as always, and found Sarah showing Caleb the basics of the parts system. He stood in the doorway for a moment and watched. Sarah caught his eye over Caleb's shoulder. Tank's face did the complicated, quiet thing. He nodded once. She nodded back. She went back to showing Caleb the filing system, which Danny had designed, and which was like everything Danny designed, more logical than it appeared on first encounter. She explained it the way Ghost had explained things to her, not simplified but exact, because exact was respectful and simplified was not. By the following spring, there were 3 work-study students. Caleb, who had stayed past the first semester and enrolled in the degree program with the scholarship, was running the morning parts intake without supervision. A girl named Renata, 17, who had the same qualities Sarah had noticed in Ghost. The kind of stillness that wasn't emptiness but focus, was already asking Ghost questions that made him pause before answering, which was the highest compliment Ghost could pay. A boy named Marcus, not Webb, a different Marcus, a better one who had come in suspicious of everything and softened incrementally over 8 weeks, until one morning he showed up early and nobody had asked him to. The garage had expanded its bay capacity. Not dramatically, Tank was not a man who confused growth with success, but enough to accommodate the increased customer load and the work-study students without the space becoming crowded. Patricia had handled the permits with the efficiency of someone who considered permits a minor obstacle rather than an actual barrier. The community college director had visited twice. She'd walked through the garage both times with the attention of someone genuinely trying to understand something rather than assess it, and both times she'd left with more notes than she'd come with. On her second visit, she'd said to Tank, "What you've built here is actually a mentorship program." Tank had looked at her. "I know," he said. "Have you considered formalizing it?" "There are grant structures for Patricia," Tank said. The director blinked. "I'm sorry. Talk to Patricia Oakes," Tank said. "She handles the formal things." Patricia predictably had handled it. The formal program existed on paper by June Youth Mentorship in Vocational Training, nonprofit designation. 3 corporate sponsors that Patricia had located and persuaded with a combination of documented outcomes and sheer will that characterized everything she did. Ghost ran the technical training. Big Jim handled what he called the life stuff, which was a category broad enough to include everything from how to open a bank account, to how to talk to a parole officer, to how to cook actual food rather than surviving on gas station offerings. Danny managed the documentation, which had expanded from a single notebook into a filing system that Sarah had helped him design, and which he maintained with the reverence he applied to anything he considered important. Sarah ran the intake process. Every new student came through her first. Same coffee, same direct conversation, same honest answer to the honest questions. She had gotten better at calibrating how much of her own story to tell and when. Not performing it, not withholding it, but reading what the person in front of her needed in order to believe that the walking through was worth it. She was 19 by then. She was a year into her degree program, maintaining a 3.8 GPA in the automotive technology track and taking 2 general education courses per semester that she hadn't expected to like and did. She still lived at the garage in the storage space that had been properly converted by then into something that resembled an actual room. She still came in before Tank. She still made coffee on the good coffee maker they'd bought to replace the thermos which had finally given out. On an evening in late June, she was finishing up paperwork in the office Tank's office, which had become her office too, in the quiet way that spaces become yours when you use them enough, when Tank knocked on the open door. She looked up. He came in and sat down across from her, which was unusual. He was a man who stood when he had something to say the way men stand when they're ready to move after they've said it. Sitting down meant this was going to take a minute. She put down her pen. He said, "I want to talk to you about the garage, okay? The expansion, the program, the volume we're running now." He looked at the desk, then at her. "I've been managing it the way I managed it when it was 4 people in a cot in the back. That's not working the way it used to." "You need a business manager," she said. He looked at her. "I've been looking at the accounts," she said. "The scheduling overlap, the grant reporting, Patricia is having to absorb because there's nobody here whose specific job it is. The inventory system needs an overhaul." She paused. "I've been making notes." He looked at her for a long time. "Show me the notes." She opened the desk drawer and took out a folder. She slid it across. He opened it and read in silence for several minutes. When he closed it, he said, "You've been sitting on this." "I was waiting until it was complete enough to be useful rather than just interesting," she said. He looked at the folder. He looked at her. "This is a business plan," he said. "The outline of one," she said. "Patricia would need to review it." "Patricia," he said slowly, "is going to try to make you a partner." Sarah went still. "What?" "She mentioned it to me last month. She's been watching your work with the program, the students, the accounts." She said. He stopped. He was choosing his words the way he always did when they mattered. She said, and this is a direct quote, "In 20 years of legal practice, I have encountered very few people who understand the difference between what a thing is and what it could be. Sarah understands both simultaneously." Sarah looked at the desk. She pressed her palm flat against it the way she'd pressed it against the workbench when Patricia called about the scholarship, the physical anchor against something too large to process standing up. "I'm 19, she said. "I know how old you are. I'm a work-study student with a partial degree. You're a certified mechanic, a program coordinator, a de facto operations manager, and the person every new student goes to first because they trust you in a way that took me years to build." He looked at her steadily. "Age is a number. What you are is not a number." She looked at him. She looked at the folder between them. She thought about the first morning, the coffee mug, the sleeping bag, the sound of her knuckles on the side door. She thought about what she'd believed then, about what she deserved and what was possible, and where the world was willing to make room for her. She said, "If I'm a partner, I want it to mean something real, not a title." "Patricia doesn't do titles," Tank said. "She does agreements." "Then I want an agreement that includes the mentorship program specifically," she said. "Not just the garage operations. Both." That's what she has in mind. "And I want Ghost involved in formalizing the technical curriculum. He's been teaching it informally for a year, and it should be his officially." Tank's face did something she hadn't seen before. A fullness, a warmth that was too direct to be controlled, that came from somewhere past the careful management of expression he usually maintained. "He's going to be difficult about accepting credit," Tank said. "I know," she said. "I'll handle Ghost." He looked at her. He looked at the folder. He said very quietly, "Walter Briggs held a door open 40 years ago, and I've been trying to keep it open ever since." He put his good hand flat on the folder. "You walked through it, and you didn't let it close behind you." She looked at him across the desk. She thought about the door, the literal one on that first morning, and the one he meant, and the relationship between them. "Neither did you," she said. "For me, for Ghost, for all of them. You've been holding it the whole time." He took his hand off the folder. He stood up, which meant the sitting down part was over. He crossed to the door. He stopped. Without turning, he said, "Family isn't blood. It's who stays when everything falls apart." She'd heard him say it before in variations in the early mornings, in the quiet between things. But this time it landed differently. This time she was on the other side of the falling apart. This time she was one of the ones doing the staying. "I know," she said. He walked out. She sat with the folder and the accounts and the space heater and the sound of the garage at night. Ghost finishing something late, the low rumble of a bike being turned over Danny's pen, moving in the quiet. the sounds she'd learned to sleep, to work, to live inside of. She picked up her pen. She opened the folder and started on the next page of notes. 2 years later, Vera Martinez stood in the bay where she'd swept floors at 5 in the morning and watched Caleb walk a new intake student through the parts system with the same exactness she'd used when she walked Caleb through it, the same tone that was respectful rather than simplified, the same patience underneath the precision. The student's name was Deja. She was 16. She had a duffel bag at her feet, and the look, the one Sarah knew from the inside, the one that was wariness and hunger, and the specific courage of someone who'd walked towards something that scared them, because the alternative was worse. Caleb caught Sarah's eye across the bay. He'd learned to read people in the 2 years he'd been here, the way you learn to read things when the reading matters. He gave her a brief nod. "I've got this." She nodded back. She walked into the office, her office now officially the agreement signed and registered and meaning exactly what she'd said it needed to mean. She sat down. She looked at the accounts, the scheduling, the grant report due at the end of the month. She pulled up the technical curriculum document Ghost had finally, after considerable negotiation, allowed to have his name on it. She thought about the afternoon she'd spent with Renata, who was close to her own certification, and who had the same qualities Sarah had seen in Ghost: the precision, the patience, the willingness to sit with a problem until the problem told you what it was. She thought about the dead car on Route 9. She thought about the cold walk to Kellerman Road, the 40 minutes of counting steps. She thought about the sound of her knuckles on the side door. She thought about Tank, who was at a county board meeting that morning because the mentorship program had been invited to present, and who had asked Sarah to write the presentation, which she had, and which was in his vest pocket in a folded printout, because Tank was not a man who used slides. She thought about Ghost teaching her to listen, Big Jim teaching her to laugh, Danny teaching her that the things worth remembering were worth writing down. She thought about her mother's voice. She could hear it now, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. The yellow cake, the chocolate frosting, the sound of someone who loved her enough to fill the space around her. She picked up her coffee. Outside the office, the garage ran at the full productive rhythm of a morning in full operation. Students and staff bikes and worked the accumulated hum of people who had each walked towards something that scared them and found on the other side of the fear a door held open by someone who understood what it cost to walk through one. The world had called them dangerous. The world had been wrong. They were the ones who stayed.